The room was filled with the smell of blood and remorse. In the dim light of a winter Moscow afternoon, a man knelt. No, he did not kneel. He was curled up, a broken mass, clutching a cooling body. His eyes were the focus of horror. They were wide open, not with surprise, but with a terrible truth that had just shattered in his mind, a truth that could not be reversed. His trembling hands pressed against the wound on the young man's temple, trying in vain to push the crimson blood back, to push back time even for a few minutes. But it was too late. His screams had died away, leaving only the heavy silence of an unforgivable crime. This was Ivan, Ivan the Terrible, and in his arms was his son, his heir, the future of Russia that he had just extinguished. This is the final image, the final chapter of a tragedy. But to understand it, we cannot go forward. To decipher the demon crying in the form of a czar, we must think backwards. We must turn the pages of history, turn back the wheel of time, return to the starting point when the name Ivan was not associated with cruelty, but with the radiant hope of an entire nation. Let's go back more than 20 years. Moscow was not a city of fear, but a place of desire. The golden sunlight poured like honey on the gilded onion domes of the Kremlin, where a young czar, the first in history to bear that title, was building an empire. Ivan IV Vasilievich was not an old, haggard ghost. He was tall, powerfully built, with red hair and an intelligent, energetic face. His eyes were sharp, filled with a fire that could light up a country or burn it down. But at this moment, the fire only gave off light. Enter the council chamber. The air is thick with tension and expectation. The boyar nobles, with their bushy beards and expensive furs, sit with mixed looks on their faces. Some are respectful, some are envious, and more than a few hide their hostility behind bows. But all are silenced when Ivan speaks. His voice is loud and clear, not the growl of a tyrant, but the steely words of a reformer. He is talking about the Sedebnik, his new law code. He does not simply read the articles. He analyzes them with astonishing erudition. He speaks of justice for the peasants, of ending the corruption of local officials, of creating a centralized administrative system to bind the huge but motley Russian bear into a unified whole. Russia cannot remain a collection of separate fiefdoms, where the law of the strong overrides the reason of the weak. His voice boomed. We must have one law, one czar, and one God. Look closely at the man. Take him to heart. He was not just a conqueror, he was an architect of the state. He established the Zemsky Sobor, the first national assembly, inviting merchants and small landowners to participate in the affairs of state. He built the first printing press, bringing the light of knowledge to a vast land that had been in darkness. Under his rule, the Russian army conquered Kazan, took Astrakhan, opened the gates to the south, transforming an isolated principality into a sprawling multi-ethnic empire. His every action exuded a grand vision. But power, no matter how great, needs a human anchor. And Ivan's anchor, the refuge for his stormy soul, had a name: Anastasia Romanovna. Anastasia was more than just a queen. She was the air Ivan breathed. Observe them in a private moment, on the breezy balcony of the palace. After a long day of arguing with the boyars, Ivan's face was lined with fatigue and anger. He confided in her about the plots he sensed behind his back, about the hidden opposition of those who only wanted to enrich their own family. Anastasia did not advise him with empty words. She simply placed her hand on his. Her hand was soft, but had a strange strength, enough to extinguish the fire of anger in him. A Tsar's power lies not in how many people he can punish, she said softly, but in how many people he can make believe in his justice. She was his conscience, his moral compass. With Anastasia, the powerful and arrogant Tsar became a husband, a man with fears and a shoulder to lean on. Their love was a true love song in the midst of a court full of intrigue. And it was this love that nurtured the most human side of Ivan, kept his ambition from turning into tyranny, kept his determination from turning into cruelty. All of Russia seemed to feel it. They loved their gentle empress, and they trusted the Tsar she had chosen and preserved. This golden age is real. This hope is real. This wise king is real. We must insist on it. We must feel it with all our senses. Because only by understanding the heaven that Ivan once had can we understand the hell he is about to create. All this greatness, all this hope, all of Ivan's humanity is held together by a single thread. A thin, warm thread called Anastasia. And history, with its inherent cruelty, had a pair of scissors ready. And the scissors of fate cut with a snap. It did not come as a sharp blade in battle, something Ivan could see and face. It came silently, like a ghost creeping through the corridors of the Kremlin. It began as a low fever, a dry cough that the royal physicians initially dismissed as a common summer cold. But the ghost did not leave. It stayed, taking root in the body of Empress Anastasia. The paradise Ivan had built began to crack. The activity in the palace seemed to slow. Laughter faded, replaced by anxious murmurs. The Tsar, who had spent hours plotting military strategy or debating laws, now spent all his time at his sickbed. He put aside all matters of state, summoned the best physicians from faraway Germany, and offered gold and silver to anyone who could exorcise the ghost that haunted his wife. Anastasia's room, once filled with light and laughter, now smelled of herbs and helplessness. Ivan, the conqueror of the Khanates, the one who had brought a generation of nobles to their knees, was now completely helpless. He could only sit there, holding Anastasia's increasingly frail hand, and watch her life's fire slowly fade away. And in that helplessness, another emotion began to rise alongside the pain: anger. Anger at God, anger at fate, and above all, anger at the world around him that he could not control. And then that fateful day came. Anastasia, in her final breath, did not speak of her enemies. She simply looked deep into Ivan's eyes, the eyes that had once been his refuge, and whispered a plea. She begged him to be a good father to their children. She begged him to rule with justice, not fear. She begged him to remember the man he had been. It was a conscience's last words, a last attempt to hold on to the spirit of the man she loved. As her hand fell, silence fell over Ivan. But it was not the silence of pure grief. It was the silence before a storm. If the camera of history had been able to zoom in on his eyes at that moment, it would have seen a terrifying transformation. The agony of his eyes quickly solidified, turning into a layer of ice. And beneath that ice, a dark, sinister thought began to form. This is the moment when we need to think backwards. Pain can either forge a person or break them. For a soul already riddled with suspicion from an unhappy childhood, this pain was like a sledgehammer. It didn't just break, it shattered. Ivan couldn't accept that the woman he loved, a symbol of purity, could die from a trivial disease. No, it was too absurd, too trivial. In his dramatic universe, there had to be some evil hand behind it all. His mind, in the madness of loss, began to piece together invisible pieces. A boyar's glance, a whisper in the corner, their silence, all became evidence. Grief needed a target, and the boyars, whom he had always suspected, made the perfect target. They did it, the thought flashed through his mind like a bolt of lightning. They took her from me. Now Ivan's grief had a form. It was no longer a ghost. It was the face of the nobles he hated. Anastasia's last words about justice were forgotten. In his mind now was only a single word: revenge. The thread that bound him to his good side was broken. The demon in the future painting had officially been born from the ashes of a great love. The palace was no longer a home. It had become a tomb, and from that tomb, a tyrant was about to emerge. No flower grew from the grave of a great love. Only a poisonous seed, watered by tears and hatred, had silently sprouted in the darkness of Ivan's soul. For many years after Anastasia's death, the Kremlin was no longer a center of life, but a mausoleum of silence. Ivan was locked up, rarely appearing in public. But he was not inactive. He was thinking, calculating, nurturing his rage into a perfect plan. He knew that to get revenge, he needed a power that no Tsar had ever had: absolute power, unfettered by law, tradition, or the church. And to get it, He was about to execute the most brutal and brilliant political move in Russian history. It was a December morning in 1564. Winter had covered Moscow with a thick blanket of snow. The people were astonished to see an unprecedented sight. A huge train of sledges, hundreds of them, was lined up all the way from the Kremlin gates. They were not carrying ordinary goods. They were carrying the entire state treasury, the most precious treasures, the most sacred icons, along with the entire royal family and their close retinue. At the head of the train was Tsar Ivan himself, his face as cold as ice, not once looking at the crowd of people kneeling and weeping in bewilderment. He was leaving them. The Tsar was abandoning his capital. This was no flight. It was a carefully choreographed act. By abruptly withdrawing from the center of power, Ivan had created a deadly vacuum. He knew that Moscow could not survive without him. The administration would collapse, the boyar factions would tear each other apart, and chaos would engulf everything. He went to a heavily fortified monastery far from the capital, and from there he waited. A month passed, and Moscow, as he had predicted, was in chaos. The boyars were powerless. The church was afraid. The people began to revolt, demanding that the nobles bring the Tsar back, and that was when the trap was laid. A delegation of the most powerful archbishops and the most arrogant boyar dukes had to humble themselves, wade through the snow and ice to beg Ivan to return to the throne. Now let's use the lens of reverse thinking to analyze further. Ivan didn't just want to be begged. He wanted unconditional surrender. When the delegation arrived, they were met not by a remorseful king, but by a cold, smiling dealmaker. He agreed to return, but with two demands that would forever change the face of Russia. First, he would have complete authority to judge and execute anyone he considered a traitor, without the approval of the Boyar Council or the intervention of the church. Second, and this was the fatal blow, he would split Russia in two. Part of that was Zemshchina. The common land remained under the control of the old aristocratic apparatus. The rest, the most fertile and wealthy part, would become Oprichnina, personal domain, a miniature state within the state, where only Ivan's laws are supreme. The Oprichnina was more than land. It was an idea, a surgical instrument designed to remove the treasonous tumor that Ivan believed had killed his wife and was eating away at Russia. It was a laboratory for totalitarianism. By creating it, Ivan freed himself from all the shackles of the past. He was no longer the boyar Tsar. He was the absolute master of the Oprichnina. And to rule this new realm, he needed a new breed of people, not haughty nobles, but men with nothing to lose and willing to do anything for his favor. From there, a Oprichnina born. Imagine an investiture in the dark hall of the Oprichnina fortress. Thousands of men of all stripes, landless petty nobles, brutal mercenaries, fanatics who worship Ivan as a living god, kneel. They are not wearing knightly armor. They are dressed in rough black robes, like the monks of a death cult. Ivan, majestic in his silence, steps forward. He does not ask them to swear allegiance to Russia. He asks them to renounce their families, their friends, their ties to the outside world. Their sole loyalty is to him. Their eyes are allowed to see only his enemies. Their hands are allowed to have blood on them only for him. After the investiture, they marched out, an army of hell. Each mounted a jet black horse, and strapped to their saddles were symbols designed to instill pure psychological terror. Hanging from one side was a severed dog head, representing savage loyalty and the ability to sniff out traitors. The other side is a broom, symbolizing their mission, to sweep away all treacherous filth from the sacred Russian land. When this army first galloped out of the fortress gates, it was not a frontier army. It was a pack of wolves unleashed into a flock of sheep. Their target was not the Mongols or the Poles. Their target was the neighbors, the dukes, the priests, anyone on Ivan's blacklist. They were the embodiment of his paranoia. They were the iron fist of his rage. They were the blade of the revenge he had been preparing since the day Anastasia died. Once you have created a pack of wild wolves and unleashed them upon your home, will you be able to control their bloodlust? Or will you eventually be consumed by the very rage you have unleashed? The carnage has only just begun. The answer to that question came more quickly and brutally than anyone could have imagined. No, you cannot control wolves once they have tasted blood. The rage that Ivan had unleashed now had a life of its own, and it demanded ever greater sacrifices. For years, the Oprichniki had wreaked havoc, purging boyar families one by one, confiscating their lands. But these were isolated hunts. Ivan's paranoia, like a cancer, needed to metastasize to a larger host, a symbol of the opposition he hated. And that symbol was the great city of Novgorod. Novgorod was no ordinary city. It was the pride of the North, a wealthy and virtually autonomous trading republic. With its extensive trade network throughout Europe, Novgorod had a spirit of freedom and independence that differed greatly from Moscow's subservience. And in Ivan's warped mind, difference meant betrayal. A rumor reached him, perhaps true, perhaps fabricated by Novgorod's enemies. It did not matter. The rumor said that the city's leaders were plotting to bring Novgorod under the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. For Ivan, this was the confirmation of his worst fears. This was boyar crime multiplied on a city scale. The rage he had been harboring for so long finally had a worthy target. In the winter of 1570, an army of hell marched north. At its head was Tsar Ivan himself. His Oprichniki did not march like soldiers. They swept through like a plague, burning and pillaging every village and monastery in their path. It was a prelude to a symphony of destruction. When this black army appeared before the walls of Novgorod, the city was in shock. They had no idea of the terrible fury that was directed at them. What followed was not a battle, but a 5-week ordeal. Ivan began by staging a brutal trial. The city's archbishop, along with hundreds of nobles and wealthy merchants, were tortured and publicly executed. But that was only the beginning. The real hell unfolded on the bridge over the freezing Fokov River. Thousands of ordinary people, men, women, children, were dragged from their homes, tied up, and thrown straight from the bridge into the icy waters. The Fokov River became a liquid mass grave. Anyone who tried to swim to shore or cling to the ice floes was pushed down by the Oprichniki on the boats with long spears and axes. The screams of terror mingled with the sound of breaking ice, a sound the survivors would never forget. Now, let's think backwards. Ivan wasn't just commanding from afar. He was there every day, sitting on a special throne, watching the carnage. Was he enjoying it? Or was he completely lost in his own narrative that he was the hand of God, performing a holy cleansing? The answer is probably both. This wasn't just mass murder. It was ritual. By systematically destroying the freest and proudest city in Russia, Ivan was trying to kill the very idea of disobedience. He was sending a message written in blood to every corner of the empire. There is no other choice but my will. Any resistance will lead to annihilation. When a massacre was over, Novgorod was a ghost. Tens of thousands were dead. The economy had collapsed. The city's spirit was broken forever. Ivan had won. He had destroyed the enemy. But when you turn an entire city into ashes to kill a ghost in your mind, is that ghost really dead? Or does it simply find a new, deeper, darker home right inside you? The phantom did not die. It simply returned home. After the Fokov River had swallowed thousands of lives, Ivan returned to his Oprichnina fortress, not a victor, but a jailer with a new prisoner. His own paranoia, now enormous and uncontrollable. By destroying the enemy without, he had only strengthened the enemy within. The Alexandrovskaya Sloboda fortress, the capital of the Oprichnina, was no longer a seat of power. It was an armed asylum. Life there was a bizarre and morbid series of days. By day, Ivan and his Oprichniki would indulge in debauched feasts, wine flowing freely and maniacal laughter echoing through the halls. But at night, a terrifying change would take place. Ivan, dressed in his crude black robes, would subject his court to hours of prayer. He would make them kneel on the cold stone floor, reciting penitential prayers while he himself, with a terrifying fanaticism, would beat his own head against the floor until his forehead bled. It was the contradiction of a broken soul. a sinner trying to seek forgiveness by dragging the world into sin with him. But even in these frenzied rituals, the specter of betrayal did not leave him. After Novgorod, Ivan's paranoia reached new heights. He had wiped out the boyars, he had crushed Novgorod. So if the seeds of betrayal remained, they could only come from one place, from his own inner circle, from the opportunity he had created. And so the purges began to turn inward. Think backwards to see Ivan's insane logic. He began to doubt his own most loyal and brutal opportunity commanders. The man who had massacred Novgorod with him, the man who had tortured hundreds on his orders, could suddenly be summoned before Ivan one morning. The Tsar, his eyes feverish and tired from lack of sleep, would hurl some absurd accusation, perhaps based on a dream, a whisper from a flatterer, or simply his own insecurities. Picture the scene. The opportunist commander, feared by all of Russia, falls to his knees pale. He tries to justify himself, swears absolute loyalty, recalls the crimes he had cheerfully committed for the Tsar. But is no use. In Ivan's eyes, past loyalty only makes present betrayal more abhorrent. The commander will be dragged to the same dungeons he once ruled, subjected to the same tortures he had inflicted on others. The act was, logically, self-destructive. But in Ivan's worldview, it was necessary. It was his way of asserting his ultimate power, a power that could destroy even his most powerful instrument. It sent a message that no one was safe, no loyalty was permanent. The only thing that remained was the will and suspicion of the Tsar. He had become a Saturn devouring his own children. Ivan was now a true prisoner. He was imprisoned not by stone walls, but by a web of his own imagination. He trusted no one. His palace was filled with ghosts, and the only living people around him were those he believed were waiting to stab him in the back. When a man has turned the outside world into hell, the fire will not stop at the doorstep. It will find its way into his own home, into his own family. And the most terrible tragedy, the tragedy that will decide the fate of an entire dynasty, awaits in a trivial family quarrel. The fire had reached the house. It did not come as a great fire, but crept through the cracks of everyday life, seeking a spark from the most ordinary materials. Ivan's final tragedy was not sparked by a grand political plot or a cataclysmic battle. It was sparked by a piece of clothing. November 1581. In a deserted palace corridor, Tsar Ivan, now a gaunt old man with wild eyes, stumbles upon his daughter-in-law, Yelena Sheremeteva. She is the wife of his beloved son and heir, Tsarevich Ivan Ivanovich. Yelena is pregnant with their first child, the future of the dynasty. Because of her condition, she is wearing only a light chemise, a reasonable choice for comfort, but an unacceptable affront in the eyes of a tyrant obsessed with protocol and control. To a normal person, it was just a small detail. But in Ivan's mind, where everything was distorted through the prism of his paranoia, the flimsy garment was a symbol of his insolence, of his depravity, of his contempt for his supreme authority. The rage he had been building up for years, the frustration with imaginary enemies, the hatred of himself, all of it suddenly found a tangible target. He began to scream, cursing his pregnant daughter-in-law as a whore, a filthy person. And then, in a fit of madness, he attacked her. Just then, Prince Ivan Ivanovich heard screams. He rushed in and witnessed an unbelievable sight. His father was assaulting his pregnant wife. This was the moment when all the laws of Ivan's universe collapsed. All his life, the Tsarevich had lived under the shadow of his tyrant father. He had witnessed the purges, he had seen the brutality of the Oprichnina, but he had always remained silent. But this time, the fire had reached his own small family. His filial piety clashed head-on with his duty as a husband. And he had chosen to be a husband. He shouted, demanding that his father stop to shield his wife. "You cannot treat my wife like this." Now, let us use reverse thinking to decipher the Tsar's reaction. The Tsar's words were not words of remonstrance. In Ivan's ears, they were the words of a traitor. They were the voices of Novgorod. They were the voices of the boyars he hated. His own son, his only hope, had now sided with the enemy. This challenge, even if it was only words, detonated the last bomb of paranoia in his mind. All reason vanished. He no longer saw his son. He saw only another traitor to be punished. In a blind rage, Ivan grabbed the nearest thing, the heavy wooden, iron-tipped scepter he always carried. He swung it. Perhaps he had intended to strike him to teach him a lesson. But his anger had infused him with all the power of a tyrant. The iron tip of the scepter struck the Tsarevich square in the temple. A dry, creepy sound. The silence was sudden and terrifying. The anger on Ivan's face vanished instantly, like a mask falling off. It was replaced by an expression of utter horror, of disbelief as he realized what he had done. The prince staggered and fell to the floor. Blood began to flow from the wound. Ivan rushed forward, embracing his dying son, and let out a scream that tore through the palace. The scream of a soul that had just killed itself. The irredeemable crime had been committed. He had not only killed his son, he had killed the future of Russia. The tyrant had destroyed with his own hands the last thing he had truly loved. After that heart-rending scream, there was a deadly silence. Tsar Ivan Ivanovich did not die immediately. He languished for several days, and that was perhaps a punishment worse than death. In those days, the Kremlin held its breath. The terrible Tsar, who had terrified Europe, who could command thousands of lives, was now a helpless father. He refused to leave his son's bedside, refused all food, dismissed all state affairs. He prayed, but this was not the prayer of a powerful king. This was the plea of a beggar, a sinner bargaining with God, willing to give up his empire just to hold on to a breath. But God did not answer. As the Tsarevich breathed his last, something inside Ivan died with him. The fire of paranoia, the rage that had consumed Russia for nearly 2 decades, had finally burned out of its own power. Now, with no enemies to punish, no plots to uncover, Ivan has only one and his most formidable opponent left: himself and his sins. His final journey is not one of conquest, but one of going deep into his broken heart in search of atonement. But we must analyze this repentance in reverse. This was not the repentance of a king who wanted to make amends to his people. Ivan did not care about the tears of Novgorod widows or the orphans of the boyars. His repentance was incredibly personal and selfish. It was a theological confrontation. All his life, Ivan believed that he was God's chosen instrument, his right hand on earth. Every action, no matter how brutal, he rationalized as a divine mission to purify Russia. But by killing his own son, who had also been chosen by God to succeed him, Ivan had broken that sacred covenant. He had committed a crime not only against humanity, but against God himself. He had shown himself not to be a divine instrument, but a flawed human being, a sinner. His greatest fear now was not the assassins, but eternal punishment in the afterlife. His repentance was a desperate attempt to save his soul from hell, and he did it as only a Tsar could. He ordered monks all over Russia to compile endless lists of all those who had been killed on his orders. Thousands, tens of thousands of names were recorded. Then he sent huge sums of money to monasteries, not to compensate the victims' families, but to pay monks to pray day and night. They prayed not only for the souls of the victims, but more importantly, for the forgiveness of his own soul, the soul of the murderer. It was bureaucratic penance, a mad attempt to buy salvation with money and ritual. The Kremlin became a place of ghosts. Ivan wandered the empty corridors, talking to himself, arguing with shadows only he could see. He disbanded the Oprichnina, not out of pity, but because the terror machine had become meaningless when its master had lost his will. The fire died down. A king may seek forgiveness from God, but will history forgive him? And what shape will a tyrant leave on the land he has trampled? The death of the body is near, but the judgment of time has only just begun. Physical death came to Ivan in 1584. It was quiet, almost banal, in contrast to his stormy life. Legend has it that he breathed his last while sitting at a chessboard. The Tsar, who had turned all of Russia into his own chessboard, where he was the only player, had finally been checkmated by an opponent no one could defeat. The room was silent. The devil had fallen asleep. But the nightmare he left for Russia had only just begun. What shape does a tyrant's legacy take? It takes the shape of a void. This is where our counter-thinking comes to an end. We began by asking how a wise king became a demon. Now we must answer the final question. What did the demon leave behind? The most direct and devastating answer lies in the succession. Having killed his talented son, Ivan Ivanovich, with his own hands, the throne now passed to his remaining son, Fifer. Fifer was a pious, gentle man, but weak in both body and mind, completely incapable of ruling a vast and turbulent empire. With an incompetent king on the throne, power fell into the hands of boyar factions, and the strife that Ivan had tried to quell with blood now flared up again. Fifer's death a few years later officially ended the Rurik dynasty, which had ruled Russia for 700 years. And then, hell really opened up. Russia fell into a dark period known to history as the Time of Troubles. It was 15 years of civil war, of terrible famine, of pretenders to the throne, and of invasions from Poland and Sweden. Moscow was occupied. The country was on the brink of total destruction. All this chaos, all this blood and tears, could be traced back to a single source. A fateful afternoon in the palace, when a father in a fit of rage brandished an iron rod. Ivan's personal crime became the death sentence for a whole generation of Russians. His legacy, however, is not all darkness. This is the final and most complex paradox. The name Ivan Grozny in Old Russian means not only terrible, but also awesome/formidable. The legacy of the tyrant was the Oprichnina, the Novgorod massacre, an authoritarian system based on fear and the secret police, which would become a model for future Russian rulers. But the legacy of the majesty cannot be denied either. It was Ivan who centralized the Russian state, crushed the power of the feudal nobility, reformed the army, built the first printing press, and most importantly, doubled the size of Russia, transforming it from a principality into an empire. He laid the foundations of modern Russia, even if those foundations were made of clay and blood. So who was Ivan? Was he a great builder or a mad destroyer? The answer is both. He was a paradox in human form. He was a father who built a magnificent home for his people, then burned it down to hunt a mouse in the corner. To understand Russia, one must understand the contradictory legacy of its first czar, its most feared and brutal. His ghost still haunts the halls of the Kremlin, a permanent reminder of the thin line between great man and monster. Our journey of undoing tragedy has come to an end. We began with an unforgivable crime and followed the trail of blood and tears back to an age of hope. We saw how a great love could hold a soul back from the abyss, and how the death of that love could open the gates of hell. The story of Ivan the Terrible is more than a page from a distant Russian history. It is a parable about human nature. It shows how power, especially unchecked power, is a poison that can corrode even the wisest minds. It shows how pain and loss, if not healed with compassion and forgiveness, can turn a man into a monster. And it reminds us that inside each of us, there may be a fine line between Ivan the Reformer and Ivan the Terrible. History does not judge to condemn. It tells to warn. The story of Ivan IV Vasilyevic is a warning that echoes through the centuries. It is a warning about the dangers of letting fear and paranoia rule the mind, of turning personal vengeance into state policy. When we close this page, the image that remains is not of battles or laws, but of a father's eyes embracing his dead child, a timeless tragedy, a timeless lesson about the price of cruelty.